Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is Concepts Lecture 7, Design, Craft, and Art. These three words, design, craft, and art, are entangled in art teaching, and they're very often confused and overlapping. In general, in the most abstract possible terms, art is used for objects that aren't going to be put into production. Design means objects that are to be put into production. And craft means whatever isn't fine art, but is also not mass-produced. These words have very different histories, which can help to explain why they're so confusing. So here are the informal meanings listed again, and some original meanings. Art is from arte, which is originally belle arti, Italian, and beaux-arts in French. And both of those words in Italian and French have been used in the titles of art academies. So they have a history in art instruction. And arte, the word art itself, is one of the precursors of what we call media now. So there is already a complicated history in relation to art in the Western tradition. Design has completely different origins. It comes from the word disegno in Italian, which was originally a principle of all art making, but has also been used and still is used just to mean simply drawing. And craft is different again, because it comes from an Old English word meaning trade or job requiring a special skill or dexterity. So this is a real apples and oranges kind of a list, and if you were to make it as a Venn diagram, they'd be overlapping in probably unhelpful ways. So I'm going to take them one by one and look at their origins and a bit of their histories. So the word design comes from the Italian disegno. It has narrow and broader meanings. The narrow meaning of disegno is that it's one of the Italian words for drawing. The broad meaning is that it's an innate capacity that permits the artist to create any artwork at any scale, at any medium. There's a famous boast by Michelangelo in which he said, if you can master disegno, by which he meant both drawing and this broader meaning, if you could master it, then you could design anything at any scale, including carving a mountain. This idea of disegno is also in Vasari, who's the topic of History Lecture 16. This broad meaning of disegno was then expanded even further in the 17th century, just after the Renaissance, by the artist Taddeo Zuccaro. He distinguished between what he called inner disegno, disegno interno, that is, the ideas possessed by God, which allowed him to create the world, and outer disegno, disegno esterno, which is drawing, but also everything you can imagine and then create. Letters, numbers, everything. And also all the forms of the visual world, because they were all created by God. These broad meanings of disegno, along with the narrow meaning of drawing, were both present in the name of the world's first art academy, which could be translated as Academy and Company of the Arts of Drawing. This was founded in 1563, in part by Vasari, with Michelangelo as its first president. He died a year later, so he never taught in the art academy. It's still in Florence. It's up the street from the Accademia, which is the museum that everybody goes to see Michelangelo's David. And since I'm distinguishing these different academies, there's a third one. The art school is not the same as the, quote, Florence Academy of Art, which is a conservative art school. The Accademia, the school, became very influential, and art academies were founded all over Europe. At one point in the 18th century, one scholar counted 300 of them, and eventually all over the world. Until the late 19th century, these academies in Europe only taught drawing. That's the narrow meaning of disegno, because drawing was considered the basis of all arts. That's the broad meaning of disegno. And this has produced a conflict and a puzzle in art education. There's still no consensus about whether drawing is the most fundamental of all the arts, as you would think if you believe some version of the broad meaning of disegno. Some people think that drawing is just one of many media, which you would think if you believed only in the narrow meaning of disegno. So it's very much still a living problem, a living issue. It's an ambiguity that's built into the Italian word disegno. And there's more about this if you're interested in History Lecture 26. These meanings of disegno are also in the English word design. In addition, though, design also means objects that are to be put into production, so it also has an entirely different etymology. Here's an entry from the Oxford English Dictionary, and down at the bottom I have meaning 7a, in which design is the art of drawing or sketching. That would be the original narrow meaning of disegno, but also the process of constructing something. And that's an interesting conjunction, separated by that semicolon, of two entirely different meanings. That second meaning was added after the Industrial Revolution, the 18th century, when designed objects were first intended for production, and people started to teach them separately from fine art. And then by the 19th century, objects for production, design objects, were taught in different schools and different parts of schools, different parts of art academies from fine art. The teaching of design has changed radically again since the 1950s, and I have 3 slides to indicate that before we go on to the subject of craft. First of all, there is a field called design thinking. This is the study of reasoning and organization that go into design proposals. As an example, there's Robert McKim's Experiences in Visual Thinking, which is one of the early texts in this field. He divides visual thinking into seeing, imagining, and drawing. That's what that infographic is about on the left. In the last 40 years, design has developed an entirely new way of being presented and taught, which combines philosophy, education theory, with scientific and business models. Another starting point was Donald Schoen's book, The Reflective Practitioner, from 1993. This was about the ways that researchers in different fields, including design, think and talk and work with each other. Schoen's book is a critique of what he calls technical rationality. He advocates a combination of what he calls reflection in action, that is thinking on your feet, attending to your feelings, being willing to accept reflexive responses, instinctive responses, and what he calls reflection on action, which is rational knowledge applied to a fixed problem in consultation with others. This is part of the elaboration and systematization of the teaching of design, which is relatively new, historically speaking, since the 1950s. And one more example, just to conjure the diversity of this field. There's also a subject called speculative design. It is also sometimes called critical design or design futures. It was introduced in the book Speculative Everything by Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby. They are interested in social, cultural, and ethical implications of current design practice, and their book raises really large questions, like how should design impact the entire world? How can we design for a healthier ecosystem? How can we influence future cultures? So from the beginning of the separation of the idea of design from disegno, and with the Industrial Revolution, the further separation of teaching of design from teaching of fine art, there has been this rapid expansion in the last half century or so of design into a field that has its own very complex pedagogy. Craft is completely different. This word doesn't go back as far in European history. The arts and crafts movement that it's mainly associated with was first English and then later European and then international. In England, the arts and crafts movement held exhibitions and promoted traditional skills. In Japan, there was Mingei, which is a folk arts movement. And in India, John Lockwood Kipling, who was the famous writer's father, taught and collected and exported Indian crafts like this piece. The idea of all of these arts and crafts movements and related movements was to counteract the spread of industrialization, which was leading to a loss of traditional skills. So in a sense, these arts and crafts movements are against some of the things that were being taught in and as design, starting in the 18th, but especially in the 19th century. William Morris was the most important arts and crafts practitioner and theorist in the second half of the 19th century. He did a lot of things. He had a lot of skills. He was a typographer, a weaver, embroiderer, furniture designer, printmaker, carpet maker, interior designer, woodblock printer, and he was especially known for wallpaper designs. That's the front door of his Red House, which is east of London, which has a lot of his work in it. So these 19th century crafts movements, like arts and crafts, were against industrialization and against lower standards of life and against loss of traditional skills. Their ideal period was the Middle Ages, which they saw as a golden age before the Renaissance opened the way to the decline of Western culture. Quote, "The Middle Ages was a period of greatness in the art of the common people. The treasures in our museums now are only the common utensils used in households of that age, when hundreds of medieval churches were built by unsophisticated peasants." It's very romantic. Art schools, art departments, and academies don't usually teach craft, but there are a number of exceptions, and here are a couple of them. There are conservative academies, like the Florence Academy of Art that I mentioned, that teach older methods like mosaic and buon fresco and tempera. Crafts are also taught at regional academies. For example, the Academy of Art in Bucharest in Romania is a place you can go to learn how to restore Romanian church mural painting, something that you wouldn't be able to learn anywhere else in the world. Academies in China and Japan teach lacquer, which is something you cannot get good instruction on in the United States, but it's very common in that part of the world. Some crafts also survive as parts of larger departments. So in art schools and academies, you can usually learn tapestry in the fiber arts department, for example, or jewelry and sculpture. So crafts are in different places, you might say hidden away within the structure of media in contemporary art schools. Last of the three words I want to talk about is art. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, you couldn't learn art in a university or in an academy. If you wanted to study art, you skipped college and you went to work for an established artist. In universities, people were studying what were called the 7 liberal arts. The quadrivium, that's 4 of them: music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy or astrology. You could get your choice, they were mixed. And the trivium, that's the other 3 liberal arts: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. They're all in this diagram. They're in those what are called lunettes in the seven like doorways that are in around the center. And that figure in the center is philosophy wearing a crown, and underneath there's Socrates and Plato. So that's what was taught in universities. There was no place for visual art in universities. That also means that artists in the Middle Ages in Europe were very disconnected from the social and intellectual currents of their day, because what counted then as learning was done in universities, and artists didn't go to universities. After 1563, when the academies of art started spreading through Europe, art was still not taught at universities for some time, so there were no art departments in universities. Universities themselves started in the Middle Ages, but there were no art departments in them until the 19th century. And art schools are even later, more recent. They come after World War II. Second thing about the history of the word art, of the concept art, in the 18th century, the philosophic study of aesthetics, which I'm going to talk about in the next lecture, defined fine art as work that is not decorative or quote-unquote applied. So fine art was identified with schöne Künste, that's German, belle arti, beaux-arts in French. If you're interested in this, I would recommend reading the entry in the Encyclopedia Britannica 11th edition. The 11th edition is widely considered to be the best edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, published in 1911, and it's online in Project Gutenberg. So the article, Fine Arts, which you see here, is a really long essay that talks about how to tell fine from applied art, something that even in 1911 was still taken very seriously and pointed to big institutional differences. From the Renaissance through the 19th century, it was traditional to say that there are 5 fine arts: architecture, sculpture, painting, music, and poetry. It's not the way we classify these days. They were named as an echo of the 7 liberal arts that were taught in medieval universities. And there was also a 20th century listing of 7 fine arts: architecture, sculpture, painting, literature, music, theater, and film. So there are variations on this, and that's just something I found when I was looking at the internet, which names the principal branch of architecture being pastry. So there were a lot of variations on this. The 7 liberal arts taught in medieval universities didn't vary for centuries, but when the idea came to start talking about art in universities, these kinds of divisions started to appear. Well, these lists of 5 fine arts and 7 fine arts and so on are not used anymore because the classification of visual art and art in general into arts has been superseded by its classification into media. And the idea of classifying what we do by media has itself largely been superseded by the notion that we live in a post-medium condition, which is the topic of another lecture. But all these same subjects are still taught in large art schools. The end of the usage of the expression fine arts is more or less contemporaneous with the rise of the arts and crafts movement and people's increasing awareness of crafts. That's an observation that you can read in the art historian George Kubler, and that's one of William Morris's wallpaper patterns. And the last point I want to make about art is that in the 1920s, there was an opposition to the distinction between crafts and fine arts and an attempt to combine the two. The most prominent example of that is the Bauhaus, which is a modernist art academy in Germany that taught design, craft, and fine art. The integration of craft, art, and design remains a difficult problem for art schools and academies and departments. So Wikipedia is wrong, by the way, when it says in this article on fine art that these distinctions are essentially meaningless in contemporary practice. It's always good to cite Wikipedia for mistakes that it makes instead of things that it has that are actually reliable for a change. So in conclusion, a little bit about cultural differences, problems in applying these same terms in other cultural contexts. I'm going to take as my example Japan. China, Japan, Korea, India, Islamic countries, they all have histories that don't involve these terms. And many other cultures have concepts that did not have concepts that were equivalent to design or craft or art. So Maya, Inca, Yoruba, Chavin, Harappan culture, Sumerian, I'm just naming a couple that are taught in the 1001 World Art Survey. These differences can't be resolved by avoiding the terms, and that's because museums and galleries and historians all still think in terms of these concepts: art, craft, design. So this exhibition, Les Japon des Avant-Gardes, at the Pompidou Center in Paris in 1987, was an attempt to show Japanese art in relation to Western modernism. The comparison is a difficult one to make because in Japanese, bijutsu is a neologism. It was coined in 1873, in other words, a new word, very recent in Japanese culture, in Japanese language. It was coined to translate schöne Kunst, which is German for fine art. They didn't have a word for that, so they needed to import the word under the influence of Western art. There was never a distinction in Japan between fine art and craft because there was never a concept of fine art. There's a really interesting Japanese historian named Shigemi Naga who specializes in the Japanese influence on the West, like the way that Van Gogh was influenced by Japanese prints, and then the influence in Japan of the West, of the Japanese influence on the West. In other words, the echoes in Japan of people like Van Gogh. So he's a specialist in complicated cultural transactions. He visited that exhibition in the Pompidou Center, and afterwards he wrote an essay asking if the Japanese avant-garde could ever be understood by the Western public. there's the essay, so you could see the title in case you want to look it up. And I've just underlined the sentence with this question. Is the Japanese avant-garde representable to the Western public? It's the fundamental problem is conceptual because of the lack until recently of any word for fine art and the unresolved relationship between that and all other forms of making, which then get called craft. Quote, in the West, products, usually crafts, which are not categorized as art, are excluded from the avant-garde. Western art historians assign these elements to the Japanese tradition, so that Japanese art is disallowed from participating in modernism and the avant-garde. This can be called a consistent logical violence. And the West selects those modern Japanese arts which already have a similarity to the Western avant-garde and then searches for their Japaneseness. That's a particularly wonderful observation there, that last sentence. So what was happening in that exhibition in Paris was a selection from Japanese art, which looked from Japanese production of artifacts, to put it neutrally, a selection of things made in Japan, which were chosen because they looked like they were similar to the Western avant-garde. And then the exhibition proposed that they were quintessentially Japanese. That results in what Inaga calls consistent logical violence. So I've outlined two different kinds of problems. First, there's the confused meanings of design, craft, and art, which still haunt the ways that we teach and exhibit art. It haunts the curriculum and the arrangement of departments in an art school, for example. And then the differences between cultures that have these words in their histories and those that had other words before European influence. There isn't any way to solve these problems. They just have to be continuously acknowledged and explored so that we don't go on using these words as if they were self-evidently true and as if they were clear and useful and well logically separated, because they definitely aren't.